Welcome to the WPA Evolutionary Psychiatry webinar series. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker today. Professor Daniel Nettle is a cognitive and social scientist based at the Institut Jean Nicod in Paris and at Northumbria University in the UK. He has published on a variety of topics, including social determinants of health and well-being, the consequences of inequality, the emotions, and the impact of early life conditions on adult phenotypes. He's the author of several books, including Happiness, The Science Behind Your Smile, and Hanging On to the Edges, Essays on Science, Society, and the Academic Life. Daniel's title today is Why Should We Think of Depression as a Brain Disorder, and Why Not? Daniel will be speaking for around 45 minutes, and we will have them plenty of time for Q&A. So, Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Riyadh, and I hope everyone can hear me. I'm looking into one device and looking at my slides on a different one, so please indicate in the chat if I'm inaudible or invisible or something else.
We can hear you and see you.
That's great news. Thank you very much, everybody. It's very nice to be here. My title has in fact changed since I gave Riyadh that title. And this is intended to be really just a reflective thinking talk in which I will say some things which are possibly controversial or provocative, really just by way of helping us think conceptually about depression. And I'm not sure that I have a settled view on the questions I'm going to ask myself, but I think they're just sort of interesting and challenging questions to ask. So my title, in fact, in the end is Depression, Disorder of the Brain or of the Mind, or Neither. And that's the critical bit that I'm going to talk about. So just to sort of set some context to this, we treat depression more and we're more aware of depression than ever before. But in fact, the prevalence is higher, if anything, higher than ever before, and the outcomes have got no better. So despite greatly increased awareness, millions of dollars of research, huge amount of pharmaceutical development, and so on, this is not a condition that we're in any way close to eliminating. And in other cases where there have been great raises of awareness and improvements of medical technology and thinking, you've seen prevalence fall and outcomes improve, and that just isn't really true for depression. So we are somewhat in an impasse that this is a condition that affects a lot of people for possibly reasons which are independent of medicine and to do with society, but nonetheless. And we don't actually have very, very good treatments or treatments that work for everybody, and certainly treatments that actually resolve problems permanently. So despite treating more, despite there being many more approved antidepressants and them being very widely prescribed, the actual outcomes haven't got much better, and the prevalence of this disorder has not really gone down. So that's just part of the context. Now, the long-standing kind of problematic in psychiatry is, do we see depression and other psychiatric conditions, but depression, for the sake of today, as fundamentally a disorder of the brain or of the mind? And for those of you who want something of the history of that kind of eternal debate, which goes back and forth in psychiatry and in psychology, I can point you to Tanya Luhrmann's very fine book of Two Minds. But of course, this is an old debate that goes back and forward. Do you really approach these phenomena, these symptoms, primarily at the brain and neurobiological level, or do you approach them more thinking about primarily about the person's thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and so on? And that has implications for therapeutic approaches. But that's really been the big problematic, right? Is this a brain disorder, or is this a disorder of the mind? And what could determine the answer to that question, and what would be the consequences of determining it one way or another? But in a way, I think there's really much prior to that junction point where we decide, are we going mainly the brain route or mainly the mind route, is the question that says, is this a disorder of the mind brain at all? Is this a mental disorder? Or is this in fact a physical disorder? So presumably the impetus for thinking this might be a disorder of the brain is that we think of the brain as the physical organ of the mind, the organ that does cognition. So if we think primarily of this as a mind disorder and we're not getting anywhere at the psychological level, you would naturally go to the brain as your sort of neurobiological organ of choice, because we think of the brain as the organ of cognition. But if we thought about this as a physical disorder, in fact, many bodily systems could be involved. The immune system could be important, the metabolic system could be important, the gut could be important, all kinds of other things could be important. So to some extent, there's a more basic question about whether we approach this as a reductionist neurobiological level or more of the sort of whole person level, which is, do we see this as particularly a mental disorder at all, or in fact a set of physical symptoms? To some extent, this is a distinction without a difference, because, of course, none of us here, I'm sure, is a dualist, and so we feel that any mental experience must ultimately have a physical basis, and that physical basis is likely to be widespread in the body and go beyond the blood-brain barrier. So there's a sense in which, well, of course we think it's a physical disorder, because what other kind of disorder is there at some level? That's true, but nonetheless, there's a way of thinking about this, about depression, which privileges, in particular, the more psychological, more mind-based symptoms. And I'm just in this talk reflecting on that and wondering if it makes any difference to the way we think about it, right? And I'll maybe make a few suggestions as we go along for how different ways of thinking about the disorder might lead you to different paths of investigation. Okay, let's remind ourselves, DSM-5 symptoms of depression, of major depressive disorder, is mainly what I'm talking about. Of course, we have to understand this is a heterogeneous condition, and that different people can have different subset of these symptoms, so they can actually present with quite a different set of problems. But nonetheless, this is the list. Now, let's just think about which ones of those are mental symptoms and which ones are not. So in this list, I've just sort of shaded in green or red or yellow, kind of whether these are primarily psychological or mental phenomena. Clearly, depressed mood and markedly diminished interest or pleasure are fundamentally psychological things. You can't assess those independently of psychology. You have to ask someone what they're feeling or they're interested in. And those are the core symptoms, at least one of which must be present for diagnosis. So in a sense, the core symptoms already make this a mental disorder, because you have to have one of these two things, which is fundamentally a mental state. But I would just point out that many of the others are not mental states. Weight loss or gain, increase or decrease in appetite, insomnia, hypersomnia, agitation or retardation. It's not obvious that these are mental phenomena. You could equally argue that they're something else, metabolic phenomena, for example, or phenomena of biorhythms. Fatigue or loss of energy, well, that's kind of ambiguous. It's both mental and physical. And then these ones, feelings of worthlessness, diminished ability to think, and recurrent thoughts of death, are very much about cognition. They're about thought. So if we just look at what the symptoms are, it's a mixed bag, right? There are things in there which you wouldn't really think are cognitive or necessarily based in the brain, but plenty of things that are, including the core ones. I think when we think about depression, at least in what I read and the way I've thought about it historically, we think there's this kind of mental core, which is these cognitions, feeling of lack of interest or pleasure, depressed mood, ruminations, thoughts of suicide, or various other things. There's this core of things which is thought, and we treat this as if this is the essence of the condition. And then we kind of admit that there are physical leak outs from this, that that your mood is so bad that you can't sleep, or your mood is so bad that you can't wake up, or your mood is so bad that you lose your appetite, or your recurrent thoughts are so terrible that you start to have various other kind of somatic manifestations of that. And we tend to talk about these as if they're not really the core of the disorder. The core is a mental set of mental states, but they kind of leak out through other channels in the body. We even talk about somaticization of symptoms, right? As if the symptoms weren't somatic in the first place, right? As if they were somehow in a mental realm and they've come out in the body. But of course, arguably that they were in the body all along. So we tend to use this mental model of thinking about depression where the mental phenomena are the core. And you see this in a number of places. For example, in evolutionary theories or evolutionary psychology theories about the set of mental mechanisms that are dysregulated in depression. What are they for? And they're for rumination, they're for solving problems, they're for interpersonal negotiating interpersonal relationships, they're for reassessing your problems and so on. We tend to think about cognition, and that guides our search for functions for these kinds of mental processes. But there is an alternative, I think, which is this one on the right, which is where this is actually a bodily disorder like any other. Well, I say like any other, it's a complex one, no doubt, involving mental systems. But because it affects so central aspects of people's behavior, like the energy they can mobilize to go and do things, their ability to get out and about in the world, us being humans, we do a lot of mental interpretation of what's happening in our body, right? And we say, I feel terrible, I can't seem to get myself going, all of these various things, this is awful, it feels hopeless. But these are post hoc mental interpretations of actually what's a somatic bodily process. As you may well say, well, look, this is a sort of distinction without a difference, because of course we believe that all mental phenomena arise from bodily processes in some kind of a way. So, what's he talking about? But I think there is a subtle difference between saying that, or between assuming that the cognition is the phenomenon here, it's the leading thing, and saying that there's a physical disorder, or there's a physical dysregulation, or there's a physical state of some kind, be it dysregulation or not. And then what's happening to the person is that their brain is, running through the gears, working out how do I make sense of what's happening to me. But in that sense, the mental interpretations, that the cognition would be kind of epiphenomenal, it would be kind of secondary. These are my two caricatured alternatives, where the mental states are epiphenomenal and where they're actually the core of what's going on. Okay. I think we tend to use the mental core model. I think it's really been true in the history of thought about depression. We think of the cognition as as having primacy, and everything else as kind of, the wraparounds for that. The fundamental problem is the way people feel and the way people are thinking. I'm going to argue we might be biased to thinking about it this way as a consequence of the fact that we're humans, and humans have a particular way of relating to other humans, which is through what psychologists call naive psychology. We assume that what's causally driving them is their thoughts and feelings, and that's the thing that it captures our attention more when we're interacting with other human agents. So we might be biased to assuming that the cognition is the really important thing going on, for all kinds of reasons to do with the fact that the people suffering are humans, and so their cognition and thought is very important to them, and that we're humans too, and humans have an evolved way for responding to other humans, which is by attending to their thoughts and feelings. But we can legitimately ask the scientific question, actually, do the mental symptoms have some sort of causal primacy in this syndrome? And are they the most effective target for intervention? And I'm going to argue there's some reasons for saying yes and some reasons for saying maybe not. But at least it's worth asking the question. And I'm just going to round out, which is really just an open-ended discussion about thinking, what are the implications of this for how we think about and communicate about depression? Okay, let's start with naive psychology. So there's a long tradition in psychology of arguing and showing that when we think about other agents, other people in the world, we cannot help but attend to their thoughts and intentions. So this is in the little video that's running in the corner, very famous experiment by Fritz Heider from the 1940s. People cannot stop themselves from saying that the little ball intends to go into the room, that the big triangle intends to chase the little triangle triangle doesn't like this, the little triangle has feelings and thoughts about what the big triangle is trying to do. We cannot look at purposive agents, as these seem to be, without imputing a whole lot of stuff about cognition that they're having, thoughts, feelings, and whatnot. And this has led to a huge body of work in psychology about so-called theory of mind, or naive psychology, which is when we encounter other humans, we spontaneously and immediately attribute them states of mind, and we view these as being causally important in explaining what they do, right? So there are particular brain regions that light up when we're doing this mentalizing, and we do it quite spontaneously. And the first thing we do when we encounter someone is, if they're doing something, it must be because they had underlying cognition that was driving them to do that. And when we intervene on the behavior of other people, we tend to do it very precisely by intervening on their cognition, usually by giving them verbal arguments or verbal reasons or reasoning with them, right? So the cognitive level is the level at which it naturally occurs to us to interact with another human and to make sense of what they're doing. This is probably an evolved adaptation for dealing with a particular kind of very complex, collaborative, highly social species that we take this stance towards them in which we attribute them as having cognition, and this is explaining whatever's happening to them, and that's the preferential level at which we would kind of attempt to intervene on what they would do. So the moment we encounter other people, right, we're going to say there's something about thought which is important here. And particularly, of course, in a case where it's the cognition that's distressing, right? It's what feels terrible about depression is feeling hopeless, is the rumination, is all the cognition. The cognition is what you're phenomenally aware of. So, of course, you present with it and you talk about it, and then naturally, your therapist would attend to that and kind of address it at that level. So we might be biased towards thinking the cognition is really the centerpiece of this syndrome of things. Trying to move on to the next slide now. There we go. But are we justified in saying that the particularly mental symptoms have any kind of causal primacy in explaining the whole syndrome? You might think that one way of addressing this question is through the so-called network approach that many of you may be familiar with. This is an approach to depression which is tended to say, instead of saying there's a whole package of things, your depression, which comes on and goes off, each of these symptoms, the change in appetite, the fatigue, the concentration, or whatever, is a separate node, is a separate phenomenon that can change on its own and can have causal relationships to the other one. So maybe you start off by lacking sleep, and that causes you to become fatigued, and then your fatigue makes you hopeless, and so on. And so people have tried to study what the relationships are between these different symptoms, which are not all present in every case. And pretty much what they conclude is that the central symptoms, in a number of different senses, the ones that are best correlated with all the others, and the ones that also longitudinally predict the onset of all the others, are indeed the ones that the DSM-5 has as core, the anhedonia and the depressed mood, and to some extent fatigue. So those do seem to be the mental ones, and so that would seem to say, well, the mental stuff is the core of this, and then the other more peripheral things like appetite change and so on are kind of downstream. But I think we shouldn't actually be too impressed by this, because firstly, in these studies, they only measure the symptoms that are on the DSM list. So it doesn't allow for other things which are not being measured on the DSM list to actually be causally primal. And moreover, the criterion for when depression is said to have come on is when you get a DSM-5 diagnosis. So in a sense, if you diagnose the depression in a way that makes the mental symptoms central, you then measure those symptoms, and then you say which ones lead to there being a diagnosis. Of course, you're going to conclude that the depressed mood and anhedonia are going to be the ones that come out core. So I don't think that this really is very decisive, this sort of evidence. Another way we could do it is by looking at the brain. So what people have said, well, this is a mental disorder. the organ of cognition, of mental life, is the brain. So therefore, when we look for neurobiological differences associated with depression, the brain is the organ where we'll see them. And of course, many millions of dollars have been spent on brain imaging and neuroscience, which was going to come to the rescue of sorting out depression, its subtypes, and so on. But actually, this is a mess, right? Because over hundreds of neuroimaging studies of altered brain activity in depression, there is actually no consistent target which comes out. Some areas are hyperactive, some are hypoactive. They're different areas in different studies. You don't get the same studies, the same areas replicating from study to study. This is a meta-analysis here that will give you the chapter and verse on that, but it's pretty clear there's actually nothing consistently recognizably different in brain activity of people with unipolar depression versus controls. So while I'm perfectly happy to believe that there are differences in brain activity between depression and its lack, they're not simple, and we certainly haven't found a simple locus that lights up when people are depressed. People with depression do tend to have lower hippocampal volume, but a couple of things to say about this. The first is that the effect sizes are small, and secondly, that we don't. This could be we don't know to what extent this is sort of causally important. The difference tends to increase with the number of episodes people have had and how long they've suffered. So, this could also be a downstream consequence of being depressed as much as a cause. But the key thing to take home is the effect size is small. Whereas, what about things beyond the brain? Well, it's ironic that whereas brain imaging has really struggled to find things that are consistently different with large effect sizes and replicably between depression and non-depression, studies of the immune system find them everywhere, right? So there are really big differences in inflammatory cytokines on average between people who are depressed and controls. And the effect sizes are low, up to a standard deviation. So increased activity for interleukin 6 and 2 and 3 and 1, decreased for interleukin 4, increased for C-reactive protein and TNF-alpha. So, and these are big, right? So the innate part of the immune system is much more active, usually in people who are depressed than the people who are not, and they're hotter, right? Which no one would say is a mental symptom or a brain symptom, but it's, again, the more depressive symptoms people have, the warmer their bodies are, which might well relates to all that inflammatory activity. It's not particularly surprising, but it's measurable. So it's sort of ironic that beyond the brain and in things that no one would think of as mental or psychiatric, we do actually find big differences between people with depression and controls, whereas in the brain, well, we would think we would find it hasn't proved so easy. Depression is also very strongly associated with type 2 diabetes. And again, you don't often see that discussed, certainly in the evolutionary psychiatry literature on depression. You don't see a lot of these kind of things, but metabolic syndrome, which is type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure and various combinations of that, is strongly associated with depression. Up to 30% of people with type 2 diabetes also qualify for a diagnosis of depression. And people with metabolic syndrome are more likely to become depressed. People who are depressed are more likely to have metabolic syndrome, and they're comorbid, right? And no one would say this is a mental or a brain disorder particularly, but these things are quite strong. So if we say, well, what systems of the body can we say really do tend to be differently active in depression, we would point at metabolism and we would point at immunity, inflammation. We might point at the brain, but there seems to be less certainty. Okay, well, let's think about intervention. That's another way of establishing what we think is kind of causally important, right? Is to say, well, what are the things where when we can intervene most effectively? Because that would be a kind of candidate for, if the brain was the place we could intervene with the best effect, that would suggest that this is sort of a brain disorder. If the cognition was the place we could intervene with best effect, that would suggest that the cognition is somehow central or primal. Well, you don't need me to tell you, and there are other people who are more qualified to speak on this than I am, But the antidepressant medications that we have are really at best moderately effective. And I think there's not really any disagreement with that now. There's disagreement about, are they very effective for some people, for some subgroup of people and not effective at all for the others, or are they only moderately effective, across the piece, and so on. But it's pretty clear that that in the trials, which typically measure rating scales of depressive symptoms after 3 months, the effect sizes are small, and no one really disputes that. And then there's discussion about why, and the superiority over placebo is sufficiently small that it's barely detectable to the naked eye, even on those, on average, even on those fairly short trials. And we also know that, to the extent that there are observational studies of these things, the long-term outcomes of people who are medicated with our current antidepressant medications are not good, right? They're not more likely to recover from their depression and be free of it. In fact, on the contrary, the opposite is true. And of course, the causality is important there, because one of the reasons they continue to get the medications is because they remain depressed. But really, however you cut it and however you look at the data, there's no evidence that these drugs are currently moving people to a state where they don't have these symptoms or need for treatment anymore over the very long term. Now, we don't know what that means in terms of tonight's question, because it could mean that the brain is the wrong place to intervene. It could mean just that our current antidepressant drugs are not very effective at intervening on the brain, and also we don't really know that they're acting primarily on the brain. They're system-wide medications that also act on the gut, for example, and lots of other things. So we don't. This is sort of indeterminate when faced with the question: should we think of this as a brain stroke cognition disorder or something else? These drugs, which are often communicated as if they had specific impact on the brain, serotonin and all that, actually, are only moderately effective, but we don't know what that means, and really in terms of tonight's question. But what we do know is that you can intervene for depression through the immune system, because actually you get also a moderate or even quite decent treatment response with non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen, and also with cytokine inhibitors. And I think no one would say that these are drugs that are primarily acting on the brain. That these are drugs that are primarily addressing inflammation. And for some of these, you get quite big effect sizes for reduction in depressive symptoms, which, to remind us, are measured through cognitive measures, asking people how they feel and how they're thinking. And yet with these anti-inflammatories, people are getting effects. Also, again, something we don't often hear about, statins, which reduce blood pressure, and anti-diabetes drugs are actually effective at reducing depressive symptoms, both in people with diabetes, with comorbid depressive symptoms, but also in people without diabetes, right? So this is very interesting that there are double-blind trials in which people get anti-diabetic medications, so medications to control your insulin, and get improvements in depressive symptoms in people who are not clinically diabetic. So there's something very interesting going here, that you can intervene on the metabolic level, and apparently have changes in these symptoms. Okay, you can also treat people really effectively by making them exercise. Now, again, we don't know what that means. There's a sort of way of talking about that. People say, oh, well, it's good because getting out and exercising makes them feel good and cheers them up, and makes people feel at least capable of doing something, and the cognition is a bit helped by that and so on. But we actually don't know, because exercise changes lots of things. It changes metabolism for sure. It changes immunity probably. So we don't know what that's doing, but you can treat depression with exercise somewhat effectively. Okay, so that's fine. All of these things, I think we could argue, would say we need to think beyond the brain and beyond cognition. You can intervene on things which have nothing to do with cognition, like metabolism, and downstream you get these cognitive effects, but that actually suggests what's causally going on important might be something quite different. But on the other hand, The other thing that really works for depression is talking therapy. And I don't think anyone would question that. The psychotherapies for depression are pretty effective. They're pretty effective, actually, not just in the immediate term, but in a bit longer term too. I won't go into the details of this slide, but basically what it showed is that you get, for example, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, over a wait list control, that's WL in this table, has an odds ratio of, the odds ratio for remaining depressed is 0.25. So that's a very big response. That means, getting the CBT is much better for your subsequent depression than not getting it. Same when you put CBT against placebo or get some sort of care as usual. So, and there are many, many studies of this kind. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. So it seems to me that we've got on the one side of the equation, for the motion that the cognition and the cognitive level is the right way of thinking about depression. The strongest case of the defense is talking to people, which is a cognitive intervention, really helps. Like, so that suggests that the cognition is very central, and if you help people with that, you make a big difference. But on the other hand, the arguments against the motion are that when you intervene in things like inflammation and metabolism, you have as big an effect as you do with our kind of standard quote unquote antidepressant medication. So that's quite confusing. So let's just have an interim summary. Depression is defined for the way we diagnose it in terms of mood and cognition. But actually, if we think about the things that we know it to be strongly related to, some of them are mental, mood and cognition and rumination and so on. Some of them are sort of ambiguous, like sleep and appetite. And some of them are definitely not mental. They're definitely physical, like immune activity, inflammation, and possibly markers of metabolism. So we've got to say this is a systemic state that kind of has some cognition going on in it, but has a lot of other things happening. And as I say, almost by definition, because what people actually come through the door with is saying, I feel miserable, I'm having all these thoughts. So of course, that becomes central to the definition of depression. But in a way, we're wrong to think that's that's the only thing going on, because their whole set of bodily systems are probably involved. And where we, just to recap what I said, interventions addressing metabolism and inflammation seem to be promising and perhaps more so than drugs currently thought of as antidepressant. But talking therapy, which is very definitely a sort of cognitive or psychological intervention, is also highly effective. Now, why it would be highly effective is something we could think about, right? That actually talking therapy is very useful for lots of things, including dealing with chronic physical illness and physical pain and various things like that. So partly it allows people to manage their own condition, and that in itself makes them feel better. But so we could think about what talking therapy is doing in terms of that improvement. But nonetheless, that's an important sort of fact to take into account. Okay. I think that the last thing, the fact that talking therapy is highly effective, and also it's the thing that people themselves report as being central to the difficulties they're having, is a strong argument for thinking of depression as a mental disorder. But we might need to think a bit more broadly about it, what might be going on, for example, in evolutionary terms, in physical terms, in organismal terms. Is the cognition the kind of the most important thing? Okay, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about sort of implications of the issues I've sketched here. Because as I haven't got any strong line to push, I just think it's interesting. In my discipline of evolutionary psychology, there's been a lot of discussion of kind of what are the evolutionary origins of this set of conditions, and what are the evolved mechanisms that are active. I'll say something more about that in a minute. But there's been also a lot of discussion about the boundary between normal, low mood and pathology. So when is the mood system just doing its job? If you feel like not getting out of bed some days, maybe that's because there are days when it's probably not good for you to get out of bed. You do better resting up. So when is feeling low and feeling fatigued kind of normal? And when has something actually gone wrong? When is it pathology? There's been a lot of discussion of that boundary. And there's also been a lot of discussion, sorry, that there's a typo in the slide. There's been a lot of discussion of the implications of describing depression as a disorder of the brain. Do we think about this in terms of brain terms or versus the mind? Which is that a more destigmatizing way of talking? Is that a more helpful way of talking to allow people to cope better with their symptoms, as it leads us to have better treatments and do better research? And this goes back and forth. And again, I'm not going to try to adjudicate that endless debate today. But this is the main point I wanted to make tonight. I don't think I certainly have thought a lot about what would be the implications of thinking of depression much more as a disorder of the body. And when I say implications, there's implications on a number of fronts, right? So certainly, firstly and very importantly, for sufferers' self-understanding, people have these very, very distressing experiences. And does it help them to think, well, actually, your immune system's going away 10 to the dozen, fighting off stuff for you. Your metabolism is under heavy load, or whatever. And if you could sort that out, the reasons you feel so awful are because there are these physical changes in your body, and they're there for whatever reason. But if we can tame them a bit, it won't seem so awful. So might there be ways in which people's experience of these very distressing symptoms would be changed by understanding them to actually be system-wide, and not just about their thought, and not just even about their brain, but a state of that their whole biology is in. Secondly, how would we think differently in research? So I've been active in the literature on the evolutionary psychiatry of depression, and I guess just for a long time I took for granted that we thought about the cognition. We thought about, why would people feel suicidal? How could that possibly make sense? Why would they feel low? Why would they feel worthless? What's happening? Is it to do with communication? Is it to do with solving cognitive problems, difficult cognitive tasks that they've got to solve, and so on? Really thinking about the cognition as being the phenomenon here. But if you start to think, well, actually, this is a metabolic state in which their immune system is firing away against very non-specific threats, using a lot of energy. They don't want to move a lot. They're staying still, they're resting. Then you start to see the natural non-human analogs being things like sickness behavior, which is where animals with infections rest up, avoid spending energy, avoid taking risks. You start to understand how depressive symptoms might be related to various dietary, energetic, lifestyle factors, which we know that they are related to. You just take a much broader view in which the set of things that might be relevant, the set of processes that might be important, actually changes, and you see that the cognition is possibly sort of changing downstream of that. For assessment of depressive disorders, I've never really known people to advocate, and maybe you'll tell me that I'm wrong, measuring inflammation or measuring physical symptoms or blood glucose as part of assessing depression, other than to exclude those things, right? Because that, in fact, the DSM says if there are physical explanations for these symptoms, right, then in fact it's not depression anymore. But I'm sort of questioning whether that's necessarily the case or makes sense. Just because there are physical diseases which are giving rise to these symptoms doesn't mean these symptoms are not depression, it seems to me. And then finally, might this perspective, this broader perspective, affect how we think about treatment, in the sense that I suppose the first great breakthrough in depression in the mid-20th century was the idea, well, earlier in fact, was the idea used to talk to people about their cognition and what the origins of their cognition seem to be, or what the patterns of their cognition would seem to be. And that's borne out by the development by Aaron Beck and the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and so on. as a good thing to do. But then when we've looked for pharmaceutical interventions, we've said, well, okay, so the cognition is what's going on here. The brain is so we need to look at things that people change people's cognition as a first move that they make. And it's not particularly clear that that's the right strategy. I wonder if we had thought of depression as less siloed, in a less siloed way as a mental stroke brain disorder from the beginning, would we have explored more treatments based on metabolic changes, changes in peripheral inflammatory activity and so on, and just had those in the set of things that we would have considered from the get-go? And would we have spent quite so much on neuroscience and thinking that brain imaging was going to be the thing that would tell us what's going on with depression? I don't know. I just, as I say, want to raise some of these questions by way of a kind of provocation. So that is that's what all the remarks I have prepared, and I understand there's plenty of time left in the session for your questions. Just to be really, really clear, which I hope I have been already, but it's worth reiterating. I'm not trying to sort of take a deflationary view of depression and say, well, there isn't really a thing there. These are not real problems. They're just thoughts people have when they've got a physical illness. Not necessarily. I'm just trying to say that the boundaries between depression and physical illnesses might be less clear than we think, and the set of bodily processes that are involved in depression might be much broader than we commonly we commonly assume. Okay, that's all I have to say. I'll hand over to questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was really interesting. Now,
sorry.
See if there are any hands. I can't see any hands just at the moment, but I have a number of issues that I'd like to pick your brains on.
Sure.
So now it's interesting that the two areas that you highlighted were chronic low-grade inflammation, which is the immune response, and type 2 diabetes. Now, as you are, of course, well aware, given that your long-standing work in the field of evolution and depression, there's a strong strand of thinking amongst evolutionists that depression is related to mismatch, and that there's a whole range of aspects of modern life that give rise to depression, either more so than in the ancestral environment, or in fact that depression is wholesale a modern phenomena. I mean, modern in terms of more common in settled humans rather than in ancestral humans. Now, both of these, chronic low-grade and type 2 diabetes, are highly related to mismatch. In fact, type 2 diabetes is now has taken epidemic proportions and increased beyond all recognition, even a couple of generations ago. So could it be that we're dealing here with a group of disorders, all of which arise from mismatch, arise from certain aspects of the modern environment, and depression is part of this cluster of conditions, rather than that one of these causes the other, that chronic inflammation or type 2 diabetes actually causes depression, or vice versa? What are your views on that?
Well, I'm very favorable to, or very, in principle, very open to that way of thinking about things. And I think it would be interesting if the epidemiology really bears you out. Like there are many things that have, in our health that have changed over time as we've gone towards more modern lifestyles. And it will be interesting if these particular ones have sort of moved in lockstep. I certainly agree with the sentiment of not giving one of these causal primacy and say, well, this one causes that one, causes that one. I think these are clusters, right? These are clusters, and they're probably heterogeneous clusters, and different people have, get into the cluster in different ways, and so on. And to some extent, it's a sort of fool's errand to draw very tight boxes and say, box A can cause box B, and so on. But in a sense, that's what I was trying to say. There's a whole cluster of things. As for the mismatch, I mean, this is a great question, and here we come back to the eternal thing in the evolutionary psychology of depression, which is these must be mechanisms that are there for a reason. Right? Insulin metabolism is there for a reason. Inflammation is there for a reason. It's quite a good, it's quite a good trick. And low mood is there for a reason. They're all there, and probably the fact that they're connected with each other is also true for a reason. Like when you are infected, you should save energy and you shouldn't run around. The various so there are non-accidental connections between these things. So then you have to ask, what is it about the modern lifestyle that's really the agent here? And that's really hard to unpick because lots of things have changed. We eat different stuff, we move around differently, we have different social interaction. I mean, that becomes desperately hard. But I think that's the kind of question we should get into, here, and it's difficult to pick apart. So that was a waffly answer, Riyad, but I hope it, you got this.
No, that's great. Yes, I mean, I wasn't expecting a definitive answer to this. These are all questions that I'm sure we've all thought about. So Annie has her hand up. Go ahead, Annie.
Thank you. This was a very interesting lecture indeed, very thought-provoking. Something you said earlier, I wonder if that is perhaps the key thing, and that's about sickness behavior. Now, I worked with a colleague many years ago who did a PhD on psychoneuroimmunology, and we wrote a paper about how non-termination of sickness behavior might underlie depression, and that the reason that we get non-termination of sickness behavior in our society compared to hunter-gatherers is that in our society, stress tends to be chronic rather than acute. And that might explain why it's happening more in terms of mismatch, and would combine both the effects on the body and the effects on the brain. So because we know that people who get immune therapy can become depressed as a side effect of the immune medication, but we also know that people who are depressed, let's say after a bereavement, have got a lowered immune response and are more vulnerable to immune disorders. So I think it's a bidirectional effect which can be triggered on either side, either the brain or the body, and have effects on the other side as well. And I'm missing the big picture thinking around this, because it seems that it's split in different disciplines, and then we miss wonderful opportunities to intervene.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that intervention, Annie. I first of all, if people, knowledgeable people in this group have said all this before, and I apologize, and I'm just being ignorant in kind of saying it again, and perhaps these things are actually just all obvious to you. But I just really like the last thing you said, Annie, which was that we're missing opportunities, right? Because we tend to silo. Psychiatric disorders happen in the mind brain, and physical disorders happen somewhere else. For all kinds of historical reasons, we maybe miss the fact that these are systems, right? And the cognition is one part of the system. This is actually, organisms are fundamentally about energy. They're about getting energy from the environment and spending energy doing different things at different points in their lives, and in a way that's responsive to how much they've got and what they need to do in the environment. So if you think of organisms as systems for sort of acquiring and spending energy, you don't make a distinction between between sort of psychiatric or mental phenomena and other kinds of phenomena. These are all just different parts of the same allocation process. So I don't know if that's helpful, but anyway, and as to your point about chronic stress, I just really to echo what I said to Riyad, absolutely. I mean, I agree, but then you really have to say, well, what is it about? You still have to ask the question, what is it about the conditions of modernity that leads to chronic stress? Why is it that it's different? How are the challenges on life different, and so on. And I think that's genuinely hard. But I mean, I not that I disagree with you, but I just think it's really hard to actually put your finger on that. Randy, yeah.
Randy, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Randy, you're muted.
So wonderful to see you, Daniel. What a wonderful talk. We are making progress on all this. It's very encouraging, I think. I think instead of just going around and around it, but saying, oh, which function of depression is correct, I think we're taking a more genuinely evolutionary view, and it's real progress. I certainly think you're right about the role of inflammation. I did put something that my only real criticism is you may be a little too enthusiastic about the efficacy of anti-inflammatories. There's a review I put in the chat that claims actually not so much effectiveness. And another person who wrote another article using those studies as an example of how not to do a meta-analysis, because the previous meta-analysis seemed to be skewed to demonstrate that these things worked with big pharmacological company support. So there are all kinds of issues.
Thank you for that update.
On the other hand, I think it's entirely possible. The exercise stuff, I mean, other therapists here, my grandest cures of people who no one else could help came when I said 1 hour on the treadmill, full speed every day. And my God, that has worked when nothing else possibly worked. But also, Brett, I think we can take it even further. I mean, for years, we were all looking for the function of depression and arguing about different functions. It seemed pretty clear to me that there's lots of different functions of depression. Or in what situation is it useful? There's lots of different situations in which those things can be useful. Dan Stein and I published an article earlier this month on what we call tacit creationism, which is this human tendency to view bodies as machines, as if each part has specific functions. And I think that's led to fundamental misconception of what these disorders are and how they're related to normal functions. That's for looking at later. But the question I have for you, Daniel, is should we instead be looking at the evolutionary origins of these capacities? In other words, what were the precursor states for these states of change motivation and change self-worth and change inflammation to see how natural selection shapes both these special states and the mechanisms that regulate them?
Absolutely. I think you've exactly put your finger on it. I mean, I think, whilst I completely accept what you said, Randy, and agree with you that depression has many functions and there are many circumstances in which some subset of these responses could be useful, that's also our enemy. They end up saying, well, it's got lots of things are going on. Now that could just be true. But I wonder if I still feel that there's something that, let's think about the things that we know are really associated with depression, poverty, resource insecurity, bereavement, loss of social support. You can put the list there. These are very strong epidemiological correlates. There's got to be something about that set of situations. There's got to be a red thread, right? And then we have to start thinking about the red thread. I think it's something to do with energy. It's the energy. I mean, you've written about this, Randy, in a way, and other people have too. But perhaps it could be sort of restated that this is actually about. If you think about what organisms do, they capture energy from their environment, then they either store it or they spend it. They spend it on various things, moving about, interacting with other organisms, mating, and whatever they're doing, capturing further resources. And fundamentally, this is a situation in which people's allocation of energy is very changed. And then I think
I would just put a point on that. What you emphasize, and what I think the future is these mechanisms all have in common regulating allocation of effort and energy.
Yeah. But the good thing about that is when you start to think about that, there's nothing particularly human about it, right? Bacteria have got to do this, plants have got to do it. So there's a really general study of how organisms allocate energy that this becomes a very natural part of. And you don't, but I suppose in a way, then what you maybe, and this is one possible implication of what I've said tonight, I'm not sure if it's right. Some of the particular kind of horrible cognition that goes with being a very brainy creature that's finding is not wanting to do anything, like suicidal ideation or rumination on hopelessness. Maybe that's not the level of thing we kind of really want to explain. That's a kind of downstream consequence when you put a really clever, self-conscious creature in this state of not energy not flowing forward to do things. It's going to ask itself why that's happening, and these are the sorts of cognitive things it's going to come up with. That's not to say those are not important, but maybe those, we don't need to look for the evolutionary function of those. We need to look for the evolutionary function of something deeper and more general, is my guess. I could be wrong about that.
Thank you.
Adam, go ahead. You've got your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Very, provocative. I always, every time we talk about one kind of cluster of depression or autism or schizophrenia, I'm always just drawn to thinking about heterogeneity and how like this initial cluster is capturing many things with different causes, and especially, talking about inflammation. These cases which may be related to diabetes or inflammation can be very different to the person who just lost a job and then lost a partner because they lost the job and is now in a depressed state, right? And I do think that the folk psychology of why people are depressed, people are probably pretty good at realizing, okay, well, this is obviously different. Your life has fallen apart. But there is an interesting question that we've just raised there, which is, maybe there is the single thing that they're all doing is just disengaging somehow, saving energy. And there's lots of times when it's better to not act. So I think, it's interesting. I actually have, I've seen a post on various social media platforms that has gone viral multiple times. And it was something like, in my 30 years, I've realized that the best antidepressant is just getting up and leaving the house every day, no matter what. And it was hugely popular. It's like millions of people liking and sharing. And then obviously some people, it's kind of controversial. They say, no, it's a brain disorder. I can't get up every day. But I think it was interesting, and it kind of reminded me of what you were talking about. Yeah, these folk intuitions of depression. And there's also this like folk intuition of the cure, which is kind of getting up and doing things, which also sort of like a bit of exercise, a bit of like activity. It's psychological activity. It's engaging in social life. But yes, I was just wondering, what you think of that. And I don't know if there are people have kind of actually hit on this quite effective cure or prevention or whatever.
Well, I am not sure I've got anything very intelligent to say about that, except that, one possibility, there's a sense in which that doesn't make any sense, right? There's also a sense in which, exercise ought not to work as an antidepressant, because if your whole metabolism is saying don't spend energy, making people spend energy should be really awful. It should be kind of doing the very opposite. So I think what can happen with these states, and presumably, many people have said this before, is that you, very much like a stress response as well, that you enter them adaptively, but you persist in them maladaptively, which is there's a way in which, you, for adaptive reasons, go into the state of not doing things, but then it's kind of hard to get out, right? Because you haven't got the energy you don't expend the energy on finding out there are actually rewarding things out there in the world. So you never get the rewarding things that would actually make your system want to allocate more energy, right? So maybe what some of these folksy things are doing, or even your hour on the treadmill or whatever, is kind of at the point where the system's turning on itself, or it's taking, it's become a hermetic system in which you're not getting any reward because you're not sampling any reward, because you're not actually doing anything that might lead to the capture of reward. It works, but that doesn't mean to say, there's a very uncomfortable line between that and just saying, oh, just get up and go out, then you'll feel better, which clearly is not, it's not great, right? So there's this, there's a subtlety there about how you would convey such an idea.
Yeah, and well, maybe the evolutionary perspective is the one which gives you the framing to realize, well, actually, you're really struggling in your life. You have lost your job and partner, and you need to kind of work on that. And getting up every day and leaving the house is not going to help. You need to be staying in the house and looking for jobs. But yes, no, I agree. Yeah, it's subtle. Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for joining late, family business. So, yeah, a couple of things. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the last 3 courses of your talk. And yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, this subject, especially the heterogeneity of cause and, what depression is for, if that's indeed even something worth looking at. It's not a single thing. In the 1980s, I worked for a drug company. I worked for Roche, and that's when I got interested in psychiatry. So I know the ins and outs of drug companies, and there's a couple of things I'd just sort of like to mention for you to comment about. One was the huge investment the drug companies had in it being a unitary disease with a unitary solution, and sort of part of that was I was asked to do a classification system in 1982 of depressions. And I realized even then it was heterogeneous. There were types of depression with obvious causes, less obvious causes. And there was all arguments about reactive versus endogenous, psychotic versus neurotic, and so on and so forth. And it was a mess then. And the only way out of it that I can see is these sorts of philosophical biological discussions, because the needle hasn't moved since then. It's still a mess. And the other thing is just to mention that probably the biggest misnomer of any drugs ever is calling the whole range of different chemicals antidepressants, because they have a whole range of effects. Some, like trimipramine, amitriptyline, are massively antihistaminergic and anticholinergic and anti-inflammatory. And there are different neurotransmitters hit by the different drugs in different places, including 5-HT in the gut. I wondered what your sort of responses to this heterogeneity of medication and classification is.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And in a way, there's been a long-term attempt to press our understanding of, there's been a long-term kind of agenda, or it seems to be a kind of idea that there is something that these drugs all share, and maybe it's something to do with serotonin and so on and so on. But actually, there probably isn't, and we expect to be necessarily, right. This is a system-wide thing. There might be all kinds of ways you could intervene in it. So in effect, it's almost part of the marketing of those drugs that there is a unitary thing, and this is the unique pathway to targeting it. But I think both of those things are probably wrong, right? But nonetheless, this is not a complete ragbag of different things. These are linked phenomena, right? In the sense that they do tend to co-occur. So I completely agree with you. I think the heterogeneity literature has never really got anywhere much that I can see, except so there is heterogeneity for sure. But on the other hand, there's kind of enough in common that we still continue to use one set of terms for these things. I think it's probably an inevitable part of the process of medical communication and medical commerce, if you will, that it's important to kind of identify targets. So say when we've got it, and have a treatment which is prescribable for all of it. That's kind of how the industry works, I suppose, including the industry of knowledge that goes around medicine. I'm sure psychiatrists know that, it's a lot more heterogeneous and there might be boundary cases. I'm sure people sort of know that informally, but the way the whole process of communication, popularization, and, trials and marketing of drugs and so on requires there to be a thing, right? Major depressive disorder with its criteria. So anyway, I didn't agree with anything that you disagree with anything that you said, Paul, but that's just some comments.
Raphael, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me?
We can, but if you bring the microphone a bit nearer to your mouth, it'll be probably clearer than.
Perfect. Is that good now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a psychiatrist from Paris. We met with Daniel Nettle a few months ago. I wanted to say that there is that's one field of knowledge that actually, and of experience, that actually confirms that depression is more like the cognitive symptoms are really downstream. It is cultural psychiatry. And from my experience, like in Senegal and Hong Kong, like in China, you have a lot of like the prevalence of somatic symptoms and especially digestive symptoms is very high.
Yes.
In Western Africa, where I was working, is very often the cognitions are actually persecution, paranoid cognitions related to sleep, and not guilt ideas. Or so that would definitely be something I find that actually would confirm your hypothesis. That
Yeah, no, that thank you. That's a useful comment, Raphael. And I'm sure you're right that the cognition is going to be pretty variable as people have different frames for making sense of things. It's funny, when I kind of first read this stuff years ago, particularly about the greater prevalence of somatic symptoms in India and China and so on, it was almost phrased as if to say, well, of course we know really what's going on, but in those cultures it's kind of not acceptable to own up to these states, so you kind of say, oh, it's in my gut and so on. I mean, no one actually really thought about maybe it is in that, maybe it is in their gut, maybe they're actually, this is a sort of equally valid description of what's going on. And so we will say like, oh, well, there's, in some cultures there's a culturally acceptable way of a euphemism for what we know is actually going on, but of course we don't know that that's any less wrong, more or less right than what we say. So that's a good point, the cultural variability. But presumably the cultural variability of the lack of energy is less. Right? That's the case in all societies.
Yeah. That's what makes us able to say this looks like the depression I know, but it's different. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can't see any more hands, but I have a few points, Daniel, just to raise. I mean, my hunch would be that the level that you mentioned of just energy capture may be too low a level to capture the issue about depression related to the human condition. I think it may be, what may be required is to start from the human condition and look at the energy, rather than look at the energy and then make generalization, because my guess is that depression in humans, in our species, is quite distinct, and the mismatch, if there is any, and we think, I mean, there is certainly evidence from what you've presented to us with regards to inflammation, with regards to type 2 diabetes, with regard to other things which we know are related to modern life. These are all conditions that have, these are environmental conditions that are interacted with human specific systems that then have led to this condition that we call depression, and whether it presents as somatic or mental, or a combination of both, one can argue about that. But I would want to put to you that looking at it at too low a level might not be the right level. I don't know how you'd respond to that.
Well, what do you mean by low exactly? Yeah.
Well, I mean, energy capture, you can look at it at the molecular level.
Yeah.
You can look at ATP, you can look at mitochondria, you can look at cellular functions, and you can come out with conclusions about what is wrong at that level. That happens in depression. And what I'd want to put to you is that is not going to give us answers that relate to the human condition, with the human specific experience of depression.
I completely agree with you, but I think I believe that anyway, for reasons that are independent of the particular things we've discussed this evening. I think this whole question of the right level of analysis is a really interesting one in studies of sickness and of health, because I think that things like depression can only be made sense of at the whole organism level. or at least, I mean, obviously there's a more reductionist level as well, which you then follow it up by saying, you know, which mechanisms are doing which bit, of course. But fundamentally, this is a sort of organismal state. Yeah. It's going to affect everything, you know, many systems of the body, and only sort of makes sense in terms of something the whole organism is doing or not doing. Whereas if you contrast, for example, cancer, you know, I don't think you need to think about cancer at the whole, you need to think about cancer at the tissue level. You need to think about the cancerous tissue and its immediate surroundings, right? The whole organism isn't trying to do anything. It's trying not to have cancer if it's trying anything at all. So, and there are presumably other kinds of disorders that you would think about. You would be quite right to think about the cellular or the molecular level. So I think it might, maybe what psychiatry is about, you know, is really these things that are very organism wide. And I think that is this is something that Randy has stressed as well. That that's a strength of the evolutionary approach, right? That you naturally think about, you have a feel for the organism. Yeah, you have a sense that the organism is a system trying to do things, and it may be the particular nature of psychiatric conditions that you have to think at that level, and diving straight into, you know, some more reductionist point is not, unless you've got some overall sense of what the system is trying to do. And also the mechanisms are probably highly redundant. There are probably many pathways involved in this. So in a sense, trying to identify one particular pathway might not be the key. So I think that if by lower level mean, but you know, you need to take a kind of organism's eye view, then I think you're definitely right. I thought when you first said low, you meant kind of phylogenetically low. Look, you know, it's only something that a higher.
No. It's the molecular level as opposed to the level of the organism, or even the level of the phenotype within its environmental context.
Yes, and
social context.
I agree with that very strongly. And of course, that idea has been knocking around, you know, ideas like Gregory Bateson for a long time. But, you know, there's a whole system here of a whole family or a whole community in which resources are getting, you know, both material and social resources are or are not getting to one individual who is or is not responding a certain way. So absolutely, you know, at minima, we need to be thinking about the whole organism level. And of course, the organism is in its environment. Its environment is largely composed of other organisms. So I think this sort of evolutionary approach does help you to think very naturally this way. And a systems approach in which you say, well, this isn't about any one organ of the body, it's actually about the whole system, is also helpful there.
David, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we hear you, David.
Yeah, we can hear you, David.
Try put the. Okay. Yes. Thanks very much for a very provocative talk, and I think it's helpful to actually step back a little bit and ask about how we conceptualize depression, and going back to an argument that Horwitz and Wakefield made some time ago, which was that going right back to the ancients, there was a recognition that there was a difference between the sort of everyday low mood and profound depression, that one of them, that the profound depression was seen by their culture as being something to do with illness, disorder, whereas the everyday low mood was not. And I know there have been attempts to try and see, well, does that stand up? And of course, at the margins, there's an inevitable difficulty in saying, well, is the depression that this person's experiencing understandable? Is it a normal reaction to the event, or is it excessive? But it seems to me that there is still, at the polarities, quite a distinction to be drawn between a reaction of low mood, which is broadly within our culture and most other cultures understandable, bereavement being the obvious one, and there's an understanding at the other extreme of people who have very profound depressions, psychotic or with profound psychomotor retardation, that goes way beyond anything that could seem as being normal. And I wonder whether you feel that distinction is worth drawing, because I think in your talk you were tending to talk about depression as maybe as a continuum, but without making that distinction between when it is clearly a pathology and when it is perhaps better seen not as a pathological reaction, but as an understandable reaction that's normal within that culture, and in fact most other cultures as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the distinction is worth making and important. That it must be true at some level, right? So any biological system, we think the design of the system is to shift under quite normal adaptive circumstances to energy saving, disengagement, and so on. So some instances of that, the more mild instances, the more environment related instances, would be the normal functioning of the system. But then, of course, all systems go wrong, and there must be cases where the system has just got stuck. It's got bust, or has got stuck. But so I think that distinction is worth making. But I actually also think your remarks already foreshadowed this. Is absolutely impossible to absolutely nail the boundary for all kinds of reasons. Although the extreme cases are clear, the boundary cases are anything but. And this is it's a sort of philosophical conundrum, right? Well, where do you place the boundary? Now, in terms of the things I was saying tonight, I didn't really touch on that issue, and I don't think anything I said changed. Whether we think of this as primarily a mental stroke cognitive disorder or something else, those issues of at what point has the system gone wrong still arise. They arise for any continuously distributed phenotype. They arise for hypertension. They arise for all kinds of things you could think of. And I think it's a genuinely hard problem, except yes, I agree that the extreme cases, you must be right. They are different qualitatively in that way. The problem is you can always imagine an intermediate where it's hard to say, and that's just a difficulty. But I don't disagree with the spirit of it.
No, I suppose I asked the question partially because I wonder whether that distinction in our society between depressions that can be whether you think in terms of it as being primarily brain and mind or bodily focused is one issue, or you just take an integrated view and you say, well, however you may have a focus, we just need to accept that inevitably we are in embodied selves. So it's inevitable that when there's a symptom like depression, it's going to affect our embodied self. And whether culturally it's actually of greater importance about whether we encourage society not to think in terms of is it your body or is it your mind, but is it normal or is it an abnormal response? And if it's a normal response, then we should as a society be thinking rather more about what do we need to change in our society. Now, obviously you talked about that and the difficulties in nailing the different factors, but I think we do know quite a bit about those. And should the emphasis rather be on trying to draw that out for society, that sure, there are extreme cases that are unquestionably come into the realms of traditional sickness, traditional disorder, but there's a much broader one that is better understood in a different way. And having the focus, just by having the focus on whether it's mind or body, somehow may distract from that, what would seem to me to be a more important question.
No, I agree. No, I do agree that's an incredibly important question. And I've spoken about that elsewhere, because I do think that there's a great deal of mild to moderate depression that, is very visibly related to so-called social circumstances like poverty and food insecurity and so on. And really, we should take a public health approach to this. Right? We should. The social determinants are, well, I won't talk about UK politics right now, but you just saw, the distribution of resources to people in difficulty is going to change in the next few years, and that's going to affect their mood. I think there's no question about that. So I agree with you. That conversation is incredibly important. And I think there's a whole piece about medicalization and, in whose interest is it to use the language of illness rather than the language of, insufficient allocation of social and economic resources and so on. So there's a whole, I have another hat where I'd love to talk about that stuff, but I completely agree with you. And I think the primary conversation is about what's the boundary of normality, and also which aspects of this are political. Like, they're also to do with what public policy decisions we make in ways that affect people's lives is going to affect their moods. But that's for another day.
Right, Adam, have another bite of the cherry.
As we end up, I thought it would be fun to kind of poke a little quick question at you on this final point that you kind of left open as to what do we think about stigma and research, and how will patients kind of think about themselves if we think of depression as a bodily disorder. And you sort of raised the question, but you didn't answer like what your position is, and if you've been thinking about, like, would it be positive? My intuition about thinking about depression as a bodily disorder is that, I mean, people would change their diets more, maybe, or maybe exercise more. But there's also a sense of it not being in my control so much. I don't know if you have answers to these questions. I mean, research, you'd obviously do slightly different research. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that the gambit of saying this is a brain disease was, I think, in many cases idealistically proposed as, this is destigmatizing, right? Who could blame someone for something that happens to their brain, right? It's not their fault. They're not lazy. Their brain is, malfunctioning or firing off differently. But to be honest, there is quite a big literature on this, and the evidence is it's not great, right? Because when you tell people something's a brain disorder, they become prognostically pessimistic. Well, it's like, in my biology, brain is as good as genes in most people's minds. It's something really biological. If you say it's your brain disorder, their hope of recovery is diminished and so on. And it doesn't actually reduce stigma much, because people say, well, I feel sorry for them if they've got a brain disorder, but I'm certainly not going to hire them. Right? Because it sounds like it's pretty hardwired, So I don't know, Adam. I genuinely don't know the answer, but I think the way we talk about these conditions, both, as the previous speaker said, in terms of what's normal and what's pathology, but also what kind of way do you frame it, naturally guides the way people are going to think about it, think about themselves, think about their lives, in ways that are probably going to be consequential. But I've really no idea how to pursue that. Beyond the sort of remarks that you made there, if you said it was a bodily thing, people might look after their sleep and their diet well, which wouldn't be a bad thing.
Right, Daniel, you mentioned an issue at the beginning of your talk, which I'm really interested in, and that is the treatment prevalence paradox, where the more treatment that we offer in society of depression doesn't seem to affect the prevalence of depression. It seems to be stubbornly constant, despite resources, whether it's psychotherapeutic, whether it is antidepressants, and so on and so forth. But this is probably a wider issue in psychiatry and mental health. This treatment prevalence paradox is not just does not only concern depression. Seems that resources that are invested in mental health services, for mental health generally, doesn't seem to impact the prevalence of the mental disorders that you targeted. Do you have any comments on that issue at all?
No, I don't. I think it's a fascinating issue. I mean, I think one a sort of folk explanation that you often hear from that is that the prevalence was just vastly higher than we ever knew anyway. These are massively underdiagnosed problems. So whenever we treat more and there's still as much, people say, well, that's because there was actually much more than we thought. There was kind of dark matter of undiagnosed problems out there. And as it were, as you become more aware and you provide more services, you just discover there are more and more people who are suffering. Now, there may be some truth in that, but I mean, I think, look, you guys are psychiatrists and not me, so you have to, you're better placed to answer than I am. But I think, it would be fair to say that generally psychiatric treatment is not magic bullets, right? You help people, but you don't, necessarily free them of problems magically for the rest of their life. They don't go out cured and never come back. So perhaps it's not very surprising, right? You're not eliminating things. This is not the polio vaccine we're doing, right? And I think
Definitely not. Definitely not.
But I mean, I guess you guys already know that, so perhaps there's no paradox. I don't know.
Well, I think there is. I mean, if we treat malaria, for instance, or if we treat, another given disease, then it affects the prevalence of that disease. But for mental disorders, it doesn't. The prevalence remains the same, and that's why it is a paradox. And the societies that invest the highest in mental health services have the greatest paradox, because they are putting in services that are supposedly therapeutic, supposedly, I don't know whether we can ever call them curative, but they must be expected to do something. They don't seem to, in terms of wider prevalence, they don't seem to differ from societies that don't. And this is quite disheartening when one looks at the figures. Now, I can see a hand up by David, but actually our time is up. So I'm really sorry, David. We will need to wrap this up. We have used up our goodwill with Daniel. Thank you so much, Daniel, for giving up your time and speaking in our webinar series. And we hope to have you again on whatever topic that you are working on at some time in the future. So, and thank you to the audience as well for active participation. So good evening, everyone.